I know you used to work out at Spittal with the
Spittal,
dam.
yeah.
Tell me about your times out there. What would you do?
Well, they were glorious. A little bit like the Darling Buds of May, because it always seemed to be sunny, and I used to go out there and just help with the harvest. And it was very labour intensive in those days. It was labour intensive when you had to stuck up the sheaves. It would be labour intensive if you worked on the binder, the machine that went through the field and gradually turned growing wheat into bound up wheat. And then we'd follow it behind and pick them up and put them up in 8s or 6s, depending on whether it was barley or wheat, and then leave them to dry. And then later on, the corn was carried, and it was carried in great big lorries, open lorries, and there was a special way that you loaded it up. If you started just chucking sheaves of corn on a lorry, it would all fall off, wouldn't it? So you had to make certain it was put in properly, and you built up a load, as they say. Most people have no idea that that's what used to happen. Nowadays, of course, they don't grow wheat a yard high anymore. They only grow it about that high, so all the goodness goes into the little bits of corn rather than into growing the reed.
Well, they do, because they do it on the road out from George Newton to
They
South
do.
Bolton.
But the problem is they don't do it properly because they leave it stuck up too long.
So it all gets wet.
So it all goes out. And then I would get a telephone call. Brian, can you give us a hand this morning? Yes. And you'd have to go out in the fields, and every sheaf of corn, you had to put your thumbs in like that and turn it inside out so that it could dry off after it had been raining. And sometimes you do that day after day, and then carry the corn, as they called it, as quick as you could, but because then it'll stay nice and golden. If you leave it out too long, it starts to go black. Yeah, and absolutely wonderful days, because if you worked on a farm, and I didn't just work on that one, you'd wake up in the morning and your job might be to go out and bring in the cows. But before you went out, if there was something left on the table, you might eat it. So you bring the cows in, then there was a milking, then you could have your breakfast. And then about 10 o'clock, you come in for your lunch. And then dinner was about 12:30. And then you had tea. And if it was when you were dealing with the corn in the harvest, they bring it out in baskets, in thermos flasks. And then you go back to work again. Then you go back into the farmhouse for a supper. And then, of course, you had something before you went to bed. And so you'd have about 10 meals a day. But, of course, it was labour intensive. So you used up all that energy.
Because the whole farming thing was a much more community activity.
Absolutely, yes. People would go from one farm. Once one farm had done its harvesting, then that would free up a few farm workers from another farm to help, or from their farm to help another harvest. Yeah, I've got some cine film, of old-fashioned farming somewhere.
Have you?
Down at the lakes, using a machine which was 100 years old then. It was called a comer. My father and I used to work it. He would pitch sheaves of corn up to me. I'd be on the machine, cut the binder cord, push the sheaves into the machine, and it used to comb out the reed and get shot of all the kernels, the little bits of grain. And coming out of this machine were several chutes. One would be wheat coming out of it, wheat. Another one would be dock seeds, because it was able to differentiate between different seeds by size, basically. And then there would be bits and pieces of corn which just came out and were baled up. And then the whole machine was called a comer, because you wanted to comb the reed, which was about this long, so that you could use it in thatching. Niches and sheaves. Yes, it was a niche of combed straw for thatching purposes. And that was a marvellous job. We used to spend hours and hours doing that. And I was just fascinated by the whole thing. Anyway, back to Spittal. I used to love working out there. And then of course, in the evening, we'd all gather in the cider house at Spittal. And there'd be little Brian down about that high, And his job would be to make certain that my glass and Fred Ayre's glass was full of cider. How on earth we ever got back to Kingsnimpton some evenings, I've no idea, because we'd been working all day long and then had an elegant sufficiency of cider in the evening and throughout the day, of course, as well. But it was all, it was, I suppose, young people today would say it was fun. And it was. And there was just sort of great happy memories of it all, really.